Barry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me today.
As we know, Brian Dunn, the CEO of Best Buy, resigned. What does this show about the role of social media and its ability to affect corporate life?
Very simply, networks, including social networks that include customers and employees, are gathering strength relative to organizations. And believe it or not, as they gather strength in the marketplace, they create real risk for enterprises. And in many shapes, like Best Buy, they take them down and destroy their business model.
There have been other examples as well, right? I mean, Best Buy was hardly alone. What were some of the other recent examples of this type?
Well, my favorite one is Encyclopedia Britannica. That had been around for 244 years. It only took Wikipedia about 11 years to destroy a business that had been around for 250 years. And so that's another good one. But there's so many now. There's Kodak, there's Best Buy, there's Borders, Susan G. Komen, and the list goes on, where the social networks now have much greater power than the businesses that serve them.
You know, there was also recently the example of banks which had imposed some fees, and it was a virtual onslaught of social media outrage that forced them to roll back their decision. If you take all these things together, what are some of the lessons that companies should be learning from these experiences?
Well, I think risk is the first one, as is reward. Let's talk about risk. In the days in which you and I grew up as a business leader, it was clear that execution was about and operations was about what we did. But the first lesson I think organizations have to realize is that the risks live outside the organization, because that's where the power is, in the network and in the social communications. That's rule number one. And rule number two, I always say, is you have to embrace that risk, or you have to embrace those social networks if you want to prosper in a socially networked world.
So what are the implications for companies when risk resides outside rather than within the organization?
Well, I think that's a great question. Currently, organizations, be it boards and management teams, are organized and oriented towards inside data, financial data, sales data, marketing data. That's internally focused data. And they're trained operationally to be sales executive, a marketing executive, a finance executive. I think people have to start thinking externally. They have to build brand new skill sets. And so I think the first thing they have to do is begin to gather large amounts of data. It's called big data, customer sentiment, and employee engagement, and get comfortable thinking about, that's the data I need to make good decisions.
Companies are not the only ones that are vulnerable. As we saw during the Arab Spring, a number of governments also toppled because of social media. Do you have any sense of what actually drives some of these social media uprisings?
I think for a long time, we all have been waiting for a voice. It wasn't more than a decade or so ago that Thomas Friedman wrote the book, The World is Flat, but he was thinking about it physically. He wasn't thinking about, once the world becomes flat, you and I can connect digitally. And so although he was saying that India and America are connected from an outsourcing perspective, he wasn't thinking crowdsourcing and open sourcing and virtual sourcing. So once the world is digitally collected and connected, all of a sudden countries and city-states and religions become subject to, I want to say, people's desires to be connected, regardless of their country and city-state. And therefore, countries like the Arabs and other countries that rule like that will fall to basically these new ways of thinking.
Right. But if you push a little harder on that same theme, the connections always exist. But every once in a while, there's something that sparks an uprising of this sort. Something goes viral. What sparks these waves, and what sustains them?
Well, I think they've always existed. Remember the old French Revolution, and then basically people said, let them eat cake, right? Well, there's a big difference today. And I always say, I carry my weapon of mass destruction, I along with you, and this is my WMD. And as long as there's 1 billion of us carrying social networks and 5 billion people carrying one of these things, then what happens is, as long as you and I begin to agree that the leader is not serving us, which is the important part, serving your constituents, not serving yourself, then an uprising becomes viral in today's world, and somebody sparks one of these things, which is called Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, to begin to realize, I feel the same way you do, and let's work together to change the leadership.
So, I mean, you brought up a really good point. You referred to Facebook and Twitter, and generally speaking, people use social media in a generic way to refer to these platforms. Now, in addition to those two, are there any other social media platforms that you think that companies should be paying attention to?
Absolutely. So all the people talk about those two. There's so many exciting ones. Everything from Dropbox, which is a way to store data, to Evernote, to how do you share information, to Pinterest, which is how you build brand relationships. I'm only talking about America. You and I had a conversation about one in China yesterday. There are social networks everywhere. So what's happening is, although people see Facebook and Twitter as sort of the leaders, these are very powerful movements that are using today's technologies to connect our interests.
Why are companies and their CEOs often so reluctant to recognize the growing impact of social media?
I think two reasons. One is we all have been trained to look inwards to build operational competencies, I would say, and greatness, which is in search of excellence, re-engineering the corporation. So their skill sets lie inwardly focused. The second reality is these outside networks are uncontrollable. They're self-organizing. They flare up and they calm down. They organize and they disorganize. And so they're not controllable. They're individual in their nature, but connected collectively. And so leaders have not been taught and do not understand how to embrace this new way of acting with a network as powerful as these. And it's not just the consumer networks. It's true in the financial networks. They're called electronic trading funds and ETNs, electronic trading networks. They do risk on and risk off in the moment.
Assuming a company figures out how to embrace the network,
Yep.
how can a company use them for positive outcomes?
I think whether it be investors, partners, customers, or employees, the networks want to be embraced. They want to feel, just like you and I do, cared for. They want to know that you're there to serve them, that governments are in the business of serving others, not serving themselves. So once companies, countries, and industries really go back to the basics, how am I going to serve the people that I'm responsible for? I think the networks will feel cared for and they'll embrace the people that serve them. So it's a change in mindset, because my view is these networks want to be heard, and as soon as they're heard, they're going to basically act on behalf of the organizations.
In practical terms, how do you actually embrace a network?
You let them have a voice in your business. You let them to help you design your products, called crowdsourcing. You help them deal with your customer service problems. You even help them design, like Doritos does, your marketing programs. You make them a part of your business, not just a marketing outlet for your business.
So we talked earlier about companies that haven't done such a great job in recognizing the power of social media. What would be some contrary examples? You referred to Doritos, but are any companies doing a good job in leveraging social media?
Absolutely. Nike has done a spectacular job, and there's some great research about it. They've reallocated, which is important, $800 million of their traditional advertising budget, and they did something very simple. They allocated it, as they said, to where their customers are. They allocated it to mobile devices, to social interactions, to crowdsourcing. And let me give you simple examples. They literally embedded, as you know, a mobile device in your sneaker. They now have a wristband that my son wears that allows you to keep track of how much running and how much weight you lose, and you can socialize that with your friend. And they let you keep track of how many miles on the courses you run. They're really taking their product and making it part of your life, both on a social and physical basis. So they reallocated their capital and they doubled their revenues while they cut their costs in doing that.
Well, one final question, Barry. What advice would you give CEOs and corporate boards about what are some of the 2 or 3 things they need to be doing with relation to harnessing the positive power of networks and social media?
Well, I think it's basically a 4-step process. Is one, and I'm going to call the process called care. Take care with what you do. One is create relationships with these networks, because they're existing and they're growing exponentially, and they're larger than countries and companies now. 2 is begin to add, which is the second letter of taking care, add their competencies, their insights to your product and service offerings. 3, hard to believe this, I think you begin to need to reduce the internal focus you have in your organizations. Stop being focused so much about what you do and more on what they can do for you, the way Apple's done with their developer network. And finally, you need to eliminate your fear of them, because they're here to stay and there's nothing you can do about it.
Barry, thank you so much for speaking with Knowledge at Wharton.
Thanks for having me today.